Uncle Mark.
Yes, Jesus. A little warning, please.
Can I regale you with a tale of my youth?
I wish you would.
As a young man, my pop, who was a kind of a cowboy at heart, used to every now and then would take us to a mountain man rendezvous. Often up in a more rural part of Utah, where guys wearing very much leather would regale you with stories of the Old West that were almost certainly fictionalized, and tell you all about the heroes of the mountain men.
I had another friend, a lady person, whose dad would take her to the Mountain Man rendezvous.
Yeah.
And she was very happy to have won, as a teenager, the skittle throwing. So, skillet throwing competition.
Skillet is different from skittle.
Yes.
That's true.
Fucking words. My brain today. I'm having vaccine brain. But yes, she won the skillet throwing competition, which is what the ladies were allowed to do.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah. There was always some sort of thing where they'd like shoot candy out of a cannon and be like, everybody go get it, or whatever.
Jesus.
Anyway, I believe, Uncle Doug, you would like to regale us with a mountain man hero story.
I would indeed, and it has a very relevant tie-in to, not only our show but kind of our lived experience. So one of the few things that anyone would consider an area of expertise on this podcast are all things Mormon. So it might come as a surprise that somehow I have managed to avoid the subject for 13 consecutive episodes.
Have you?
13, if you disregard Super Del Shanzi, which on balance, I hope you do.
Please disregard Super Del Shanzi.
Yeah. But at long last, I have decided to return to the corporate real estate development and wealth management firm masquerading as religion, which happens to dominate our pretty great state.
Yeah.
I don't know why. Perhaps it's our new feckless and useless governor that is in a desperate effort to reclaim the title of worst governor from those of Texas and Florida. Or perhaps it's our legislature, which is disproportionately Mormon, which is in session and is trying to do everything in its power to ruin any chance we may have to exit this catastrophic pandemic and or recover from this economic disaster.
Well,
Go
hold
team.
on. They're also trying to ban trans children from sports, Doug.
That is right.
Give them some
They're
credit.
doing the Lord's work is what we're getting.
They're covering all the bases.
Yeah, the Utah legislature is, there's few in the country that prove the axiom more true than no one's life, liberty, or property is safe when the legislature is in session.
Right.
So,
Right.
Or perhaps I want to return to a Mormon subject because the new Netflix documentary, Murder Among the Mormons, about the forgery and bombing spree of one Mark Hoffman that we talked about back in episode 136, is trending.
Yeah.
But like it says in the book of Proverbs, quote, "As a dog returns to his vomit, so a fool repeats his folly." So today I want to take another high dive into the shallow end of the baptismal font and talk about another chapter of Mormon history. This is a chapter that is not generally well known, and when we get to the end, we'll talk about that. I find that to be somewhat galling, how much of our history in the state was not taught to us, and there's reasons why, as we'll discuss.
Mean the most of it.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And had one or two things gone a little differently in the story, the West and indeed American history would look very different today. So today I want to talk about Jim Bridger and the Mormons. Most people at least recognize the name Jim Bridger, and many have a passing knowledge that he was a legendary mountain man and feature in the history of the West. What many may not know is that he played a very pivotal role in Mormon history, both for the benefit of the saints and eventually to their detriment. So
I love that you just referred to them as the saints.
Yes, well, that's a fair point. In a lot of the histories, like in the olden days, they were called the Mormons or the Saints.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a fair point.
I think that they would still accept saints, right?
Oh no, that's how we grew up referring to our damn selves. That's
Right.
what's crazy.
Yes.
So let's start the story from the perspective of Jim Bridger, who he was and what he did and how he first encountered the Mormons, helped them, then soured on them, and may have both accidentally saved them and also prevented them from escaping their desert kingdom here in Utah. It's a weird story. There are a few names in the settling of the West that reach the level of legend like Jim Bridger. On that list would certainly be Kit Carson, Jedediah Smith, and George Armstrong Custer. And it should come as no surprise that Bridger knew all of them, and nearly all of them considered Bridger to be the greatest among them. Bridger was born in March of 1804 in Richmond, Virginia, only 21 months and 600 miles away from another birth of another notable character, Joseph Smith. Bridger's family relocated to St. Louis while Bridger was still a boy, which at the time was on the edge of civilization and the gateway to the great American frontier that Lewis and Clark had explored the same year as Bridger's birth. So this was very uncharted territory if you just looked west.
I feel like St. Louis is still on the edge of civilization.
That's fair.
It's just still on the edge.
Yeah.
Bridger was orphaned at 13, and although he would go on to speak French, Spanish, as well as obviously English and several Native American dialects, he remained illiterate his entire life.
Really?
At 8, yeah, it's that one of those crazy things where you can be that like virtuoso, and just no one ever sat you down and taught you how to read or write.
Wow.
At 18, he joined the William Henry Ashley fur trading expedition along the Missouri River, and then would spend the rest of his 77 years trading, trapping, and exploring the West. It was on that fur trading expedition one Hugh Glass was attacked by a mother bear, badly mauled, and eventually left for dead, which was depicted in the Leonardo DiCaprio film The Revenant. Mm-hmm. In that film, Jim Bridger is depicted as a young man who is tasked with staying with Glass until he succumbed to his wounds and then burying him. Then they left him for dead.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, the young kid in that movie is supposed to be Jim Bridger.
Huh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, but that account is almost certainly apocryphal. The only in the account that was written, and these guys weren't stopping to write screenplays and journals. They were busy, fighting off Native Americans and animals. There was a guy named Bridgest that was with Glass. It may not have been Bridger at all. He may have had nothing to do with the whole affair. So, Bridger was among the first Americans to see the natural wonders of Yellowstone. Let me rephrase that. First European Americans to see the natural wonders of Yellowstone.
Right.
And may have been the first white man to see the Great Salt Lake. Although that distinction may belong to a French trapper, Etienne Provost, but we will never know. Do you guys remember the story when we were kids about the first mountain man to reach the Great Salt Lake? He stuck his finger in it, realized it was salty, and thought it was a branch of the Pacific?
Yeah, I kind of remember that.
Yeah, that was a story. That was Bridger.
Okay.
So his knowledge of the local geography, weather, flora, fauna, and Native American tribes made him the most sought-after guide for both military and civilian overland expeditions. So this would be his profession for the most of the rest of his life. And although he discovered several routes and passes, some of which still bear his name, that shortened the overland trek and made the journey easier, he was not without his muck-ups. Most famous among them, advising the Donner Party in 1846 that their proposed shortcut was probably fine.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Oh, shit.
Yeah. His attitude toward the Native American tribes was somewhat complicated. Enlightened for the time, surely, but certainly complicated from our perspective. He was mostly highly regarded by the local tribes, learning their languages and trading honestly with them. He married a woman from the Flathead Indian tribe in 1835, but because this was the West, she died several years later. So he married the daughter of a Shoshone chief, but she died 3 years later in childbirth. So in 1850, he married the daughter of another Shoshone chief. Of the 7 children that he had from these 3 marriages, only 1 would outlive him.
Oh, my God.
I know.
God. What a time to be alive.
Exactly. So,
or not be alive, depending.
Yeah, truly.
What a time to die.
However, he also worked often as a guide for the military, whose prime directive at that time was to steal native land and displace the inhabitants. He even led the army during the infamous Powder River expedition against the Sioux and Cheyenne, which, contextually seems like a minor massacre, but at the time was a big deal. He detested rough treatment of the natives, put a small pin in that for a second, but probably naively believed that there was enough land and resources for everyone. So to further that purpose, in 1843, he built a trading post, coincidentally named Fort Bridger, near modern-day Green River, Wyoming, to outfit and support expeditions coming through. Unbeknownst to Bridger, the very next year, Joseph Smith and his brother would meet their fate in Carthage, Illinois, which we talked about in episode 96, eventually leaving Brigham Young in charge of the Mormons and then their exodus from the United States. This brings us to June of 1847, when a group of Mormon pioneers led by Young himself reached Fort Bridger. Young and Bridger met to discuss the Great Salt Lake Valley, which it was known at the time, of which Bridger was the foremost authority. We talked about Young and the Mormons' arrival in the valley back in episode 97. Although the Mormons had decided on this destination before they began their journey, they knew where they were going.
Yeah.
First-hand information on the valley was scarce, to say the least. So having an audience with the only true expert was invaluable. Bridger thought it was ill-advised to bring such a large host into what was truly a bleak and desolate salt desert, but that die had been cast. So Bridger gave them needed information about the mountain passes, the sources of water, and other bits of information. The Mormons tarried another day, but did not buy any provisions from Bridger, balking at the price. So.
Thanks for the information and go fuck yourself.
Exactly.
Well, they did have just hand carts full of provisions.
Exactly.
They were well provided for.
The Mormons made it to the valley by July 24th, and the influx of Mormons began in earnest over the next few years. As Great Salt Lake City, again how it was known at the time, grew out of the desert, Bridger made many visits to the city, but there are no accounts of him and Young ever meeting again. However, they were very much aware of each other. Over time, Bridger soured on the Mormons, mostly because of their treatment of the native tribes. The moment the Mormons reached the Salt Lake Valley, they sent out mini expeditions to secure any source of water they could find for hundreds of miles.
Yeah, because this place that we all live in is a desert hellscape, and it would be ridiculous to stop here.
Yeah, exactly. So once they secured a source of water, the Mormons felt none of Bridger's notions about sharing in the plenty, which inevitably led to conflicts with the native tribes. In these skirmishes, the better armed and more ruthless Mormons always came out on top, driving the tribes further and further away from their traditional sources of water and into far less desirable lands, only to be invaded again. Bridger knew all these tribes. Like I said, he spoke many of their languages. He married into several of them. And he was well known to all of them. So they looked to him for some form of relief from the Mormons, some kind of ambassador to the Mormons. And
Who do I look to for relief from the Mormons?
Right.
How can I find that?
Right. Great question. So Bridger couldn't do anything about the Mormons. He had no power with them. So he began selling arms to the tribes to level the playing field a bit.
Oh, wow.
Love it.
Yeah, but this was illegal under federal law at the time. Yes, assholes, there have been gun restrictions in American history. So. In 1853, Young got wise to Bridger's arms sales, and being not only the territorial governor, Young was also the federal Indian agent, because why not? So Young issued a warrant for Bridger's arrest and dispatched a posse of, depending on the account, 48 or 150 militiamen to arrest Bridger. But it was a big force. Bridger was forewarned and managed to gather up all his arms and ammunition and beat a hasty retreat. The posse, led by one of Young's personal guard, William Adams Wild Bill Hickman, awesome name.
Not Hickok.
Not Hickok. Yeah, I think if your name was...
Sorry, Doug, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say Hickman was the other Porter Rockwell, right? He was
exactly
the other one of Brigham Young's assassins and enforcers.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So Hickman found Fort Bridger deserted and empty of any arms, but with lots of provisions, including a large supply of whiskey and rum, which the posse promptly destroyed. I think...
Rude.
I think we've all come to appreciate the value of a good stock of liquor during a pandemic.
Yeah.
Imagine how much more valuable that stock would be when the nearest liquor store was hundreds of hostile miles away.
Right.
So it was a huge fuck you to Bridger, right? Like the warrant didn't call for that. The posse occupied Fort Bridger, but then they even built a trading post called Fort Supply 12 miles to the southwest so that Mormon pioneers would not be forced to ever trade with Bridger again. So Bridger, now with a warrant out for his arrest, his livelihood under threat, and his earthly wealth up in smoke, vowed revenge, which he would get. Kind of. So when the Utah War began in 1857, Bridger was all too happy to act as a guide for the U.S. Army. We talked about the Utah War as context for the Mountain Meadows Massacre back in episode 51, but just a little recap. Word of Mormon polygamy and depravity back in the eastern United States was causing quite the stir. In fact, the winning presidential platform for James Buchanan in 1857 stated that it was, quote, the duty of Congress to prohibit in the territories those twin relics of barbarism, polygamy, and slavery.
Huh.
So once in the White House, Buchanan felt that he had to make good on that promise, so he dispatched 2,500 federal troops to march to Salt Lake City, establish a military presence in the territory, install a new territorial governor, and keep an eye on the Mormons. So the Utah expedition might be worthy of its own segment someday, because it was a piss-poor effort front to back.
Oh, yeah?
Oh, yeah. And it's a sign of how disorganized and badly managed was the antebellum U.S. Army. The expedition didn't set out until July of 1857 to make the overland journey. This was 4 full months after another ill-fated expedition had set out along that same trail, the Baker-Fancher Party. We'll talk about that in a minute. This was much too late in the season, but there was substantial pressure, political pressure, to deal with the Mormon problem post-haste before the inevitable Civil War broke out. So they were sent on this expedition far, far too late because of political pressure. And aside from starting late, the expedition was poorly provisioned, badly led, and undisciplined. Their leader, Colonel Edmund B. Alexander, would prove to be timid and indecisive. Somewhere along the way, they contacted and hired Bridger to try and get them to Salt Lake before the winter set in. So the slow pace of the expedition gave Young plenty of time to prepare. He called up the Nauvoo Legion, which was his militia force made up of all able-bodied men between 15 and 60, that numbered some 6,000.
Jesus.
Yeah. Although not a battle-hardened military force, the Legion knew the land, they were supported by the population, and they were fighting for their homes. So Young also declared martial law and shut down all travel through the territory. The Baker-Fancher Party had just made it through already, so they were before that ban happened. And during that time, Brigham Young proclaimed the following, quote, "Twice in Missouri and once in Illinois, they drove us from our homes at the point of a bayonet, and that too by aid of the state authority. They murdered my dear friends Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith and many others. Mobs robbed and murdered us while the entire nation looked on without lifting one hand to help us. And now the U.S. Army is coming to take our homes. A body of troops, well armed and equipped," they weren't, "evidently ordered to Utah by the President of the United States. They're coming without warning. Forgive me, Father, if I'm wrong, but this time we will not turn the other cheek. This is our home, our Zion. This time we fight back." So there you go. Unless anyone
he wasn't totally wrong.
No, that everything he said in there.
They were under attack.
They were under attack. They had been driven out of the United States. Their own culpability in many of those events is certainly absent from that quote.
Right.
But he's not wrong. Lest anyone think that the Mormons were not capable of violence, it was at that very moment, early September of 1857, that a Mormon militia in southern Utah was busy carrying out the Mountain Meadows Massacre, killing some 120 pioneers from Arkansas. So for more on that fun, go back to episode 51.
Not to mention all of the Native Americans that they had just slaughtered.
Yep, across the entire Intermountain West. 100%.
Yeah, I mean the Timpanogos, the Timpanogos tribe. I think they killed a minimum 100 of them in one incident.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
So although the Army expedition had no idea about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, they were starting to fear conflict with the Mormons. As they approached the territory, the Nauvoo Legion began a campaign of harassment and scorched earth to slow them down. This campaign was very effective. Farms were abandoned, crops burned, and flocks scattered to prevent any of it from falling into the Army's hands. And not only that, but the Legion would also constantly harass the expedition by firing their weapons in the air just out of rifle range day and night. In the only direct skirmish of the war, a small raiding party led by one Orson Porter Rockwell, who we should definitely do a segment on someday.
Yeah. We should.
Attacked the Army camp early in the morning in an attempt to scatter their horses and pack animals. Just a side note, Bridger and Rockwell knew each other. Even the Old West wasn't big enough to contain such two larger-than-life figures. They first met at the original meeting with Brigham Young in 1847, but had encountered each other many times in Salt Lake and on the trail out in the bush. By all accounts, they actually liked each other. So this raid on the Army was a total fail. The bell they were using to scatter the flocks got caught in a thicket, and all the animals just ran back to the Army. So, well done. Shots were fired, but only up in the air to scare the animals, and no one was hurt or killed. This did serve to let the Army know, however, that the Mormons were at the very least not afraid to pick a fight. So It's now October, winter is coming, and the poorly provisioned expedition had to make a very fateful decision. They needed to get to Salt Lake Valley as quick as they could, where they could construct a fort and survive the winter. But the most direct route took them through several mountain canyons, like you mentioned, Uncle Dan, where the Legion was clearly lying in wait. Or they could turn north, head up and around those passes, and enter Salt Lake from the north rather than the east. but this route was literally twice as long. So they were confronted with, let's get to Salt Lake, but through the shortest path is probably going to get us shot, or we go up and around, it'll take twice as long, and winter will certainly have set in by the time we get there.
And we have to go through Davis County, which is terrible.
The Davis, the I-15, northern I-15 is a goddamn nightmare.
It's all big box stores. They would have hated it.
Yeah. Colonel Alexander dawdled for several crucial days trying to figure out what to do. He finally asked Bridger what he thought they should do. So Bridger kind of had to weigh those two twin dangers, and knowing the danger that both of them posed and that neither route was optimal anymore, he advised going north to avoid conflict. Alexander agreed, and that's what they did. So this one decision to go north instead of east is one of those sliding doors moments where all of history turns. And yes, that's the film Sliding Doors starring Gwyneth Paltrow. I bet you didn't think I could shoehorn her into this story. So,
well, wait until we start talking about Brigham Young's Jade egg.
Oh, God.
The expedition did indeed head north, but within days they were caught in a massive winter storm and forced them to turn back and to try and seek refuge at Fort Bridger, which, of course, when they got there, had been burned to the ground as part of the Legion's Scorched Earth campaign. So the expedition was forced to cobble together what shelter they could and wait out the winter, freezing and under-provisioned, which also meant they had no chance of getting to the Salt Lake Valley until 1858. Had the army marched east, they almost certainly would have gotten into a hot war with the Mormons. The Legion was planning a massive ambush in the heavily fortified Echo Canyon, and since they occupied the high ground, like you said, Dan, and outnumbered the beleaguered expedition nearly 3-1, it would have, in all probability, been a bloodbath and a total defeat for the U.S. Army. There's no telling what the U.S. government would have done in retaliation, but it would have been violent and overwhelming.
Yeah, it would have been something for sure.
Yep, and the whole history of the West would have been radically different. Had the expedition even made it through the northern route and entered the valley from the north, things could have easily escalated in that case as well. The Mormons had made plans to abandon the city of Salt Lake and burn it to the ground if they could not stave off the army. Put a little pin in that for a second.
I did not know that.
Yeah, they had actively started planning for that very eventuality, right? They were not going to let the city fall into federal hands. But by the time of the spring thaw, a whole host of circumstances had changed. Young, knowing that if he managed to win the battle with the army, he would be bringing down the wrath of the entire United States upon them, and now fully aware of the events at the Mountain Meadows Massacre, he had good reason to believe that he may already have done so. So during the winter, Young made several overtures to the Buchanan administration, offering to vacate his seat as territorial governor, allow a military presence in the valley, and even get provisions to the wretched expedition at Fort Bridger. This all worked, and by the time the expedition was ready to march again, the Utah War was over. So I mentioned a little earlier that it's crazy. And it was Bridger's decision to go north. It really did fall to him. And then the fact that they were stopped by that winter storm and prevented from getting into the valley until the next year. Had they entered the valley either route, things could have gone so differently in the West, and certainly for the Mormons.
They would have inevitably gone differently.
Yes.
There's no way it could have. It couldn't have.
Yeah, they might have won the little skirmish with that small number, but then 20,000 more would come. Yeah,
precisely. Probably under the command of General Lee, actually.
Yeah, competent.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier that the Mormons had made plans to abandon and torch the city. Well, another little wrinkle of the story is that they had planned on heading north toward the Pacific Northwest. South and southwest weren't really options because of the populations in California. So Young began setting up forts and exploring routes to the north of Salt Lake. The first of these forts was a small fort near Tendoy, Idaho, about 350 miles away. The fort was called Fort Limhi, of course named after a character in the Book of Mormon.
Right.
And as the winter of 1857 progressed, the Fort Limhi had about 200 inhabitants that had been busy planting crops and raising cattle for the possible arrival of the rest of the Mormons. During this tense winter, while the U.S. Army expedition was hunkered down at Fort Bridger, and Young was weighing his options, an alliance of Nez Perce, Bannock, and Shoshone Native Americans attacked Fort Limhi, scattered the livestock, and even killed a few Mormons.
Oh, wow.
The remainder beat a hasty retreat back to Salt Lake. Here's the thing. Bridger knew these tribes, and at the very least condoned, if not encouraged, the raid on Fort Limhi, most likely with the express purpose of shutting down any possible escape for the Mormons. So although this little skirmish was somewhat minor, it had the intended effect of closing any northern escape route to the Mormon, church. It was certainly in part the loss of this option that helped cause Brigham Young to rethink his strategy and reach out to the Buchanan administration. So with the
and apparently it's why Oregon is liberal right now instead of a bunch of crazy Mormons.
Yeah, that's exactly. And they were preparing to like abandon Salt Lake and head up to Oregon. So there you go. With the Utah War over and at least a measure of his revenge taken, Bridger returned to trapping, trading, and guiding until his death, ironically in Missouri, in 1881 at the age of 77, which was the same age that Brigham Young died at 4 years earlier. So here's the thing I talked about at the beginning. I think this story is incredibly fascinating. Jim Bridger had a disproportionate role in Utah history and American history, and we never were taught this in school.
No, I knew about Jim Bridger, but he was a very side character.
He's kind of like I'm guessing that if you had asked young Dan who Jim Bridger was and whether or not he was real, I don't think I would have known. I would have known the name, but would I have known if he was any more or less real than Pecos Bill
or Paul Bunyan or
right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It seemed like this sort of legendary figure that you don't know what he did.
And quite a chess player, like that, bottling up the Mormons here and making, Brigham Young, we were taught was just this masterful statesman and prophet and founder of the whole fucking West. But it's great that this kind of trapper was able to bottle them up and make them stay here.
Yeah, and it successfully. Yeah, pretty cool. All right, cool. There you go.
All righty then. Well, with that, let's not head north.